The Kennedys, an American Drama, by Peter Collier and David Horowitz. When summer came, Ethel arranged another trip to keep David occupied and out of the house. This time there was no effort to involve him in any socially redeeming activity. He was given a job doing manual labor at a place called Caribou Ranch near Boulder, Colorado. Just before he left the Cape, David was talking to Pam KELLEY, younger sister of the girl who had been involved with Bobby so long. Spunky, with rimless glasses and long blonde hair, Pam confessed that she too was having trouble with her parents. She asked David if she and a girlfriend could go west with him in his car, and he said yes. All during the trip across country, David tried to get Pam's friend to sleep with him, but she wouldn't yield and finally flew home. So he slept with Pam. I told him I'd had a terrible year, she recalls, and that I'd been feeling nobody loved me. He smiled that wounded, angelic smile of his and said that he'd been going through the same thing. We sort of decided to love each other. Pam had known him all his life and watched what had happened, how hurt he had been by his eerie involvement in his father's death, how he had tried to be like Bobby Jr., but didn't have the same talent for self-dramatization, how he had been traumatized by being alone within the family. He didn't have the hardness or the physicalness of the rest of them. David was always the soft one. Ethel found out that they were together in Colorado and became enraged. She went around complaining how the KELLEY girls were always seducing her boys, Pam says wryly. That was a laugh. They couldn't stay together anymore at the ranch, so Pam slept in the Chevy Impala and sat out on a hill watching David shovel chicken manure all day. After he got off work, they would drive into Boulder to drink beer and play pool in a working-class bar. After several weeks, they decided to go back home. As they were driving across the country, they picked up a young man who was hitchhiking and took him as far as St. Louis with them. When they parted, the rider suggested they make a detour to visit his parents in New Orleans. They did, and it was like a honeymoon. This boy had called ahead, and when we showed up, his mother had everything ready, Pam remembers. The only thing was that she had arranged to put us in 2 different bedrooms. David asked if we could sleep together, and she said yes. It was a wonderful week we spent there. They had a swimming pool, wine for dinner every evening. She gave us dimes to ride the trolley downtown. When they got back to Hyannis, all this changed. They went first to the Kelleys, where Pam dropped off her clothes, and then to Ethel's. They stayed together in the playhouse on the back lawn. It was a Saturday night, Pam recalls. We slept in this tiny miniature bed, and the next morning David got up and said, "Uh-oh, I've got to go to 11 o'clock Mass." I said, "What am I supposed to do, stay in this 2-by-2 house and wait? No way. I'll sneak out and meet you someplace for lunch." David panicked and said for me to sit tight because his mother would go into a rage if she knew I was with him. Then he left. I had started my period that night. The little white room of the playhouse was half red, the sheets, the mattress, and the rest of the little miniature bed. I just rolled everything into one bloody pile and bolted. I was scared of Ethel, who was always hysterical, even when she wasn't mad. I thought that if I was caught, she'd hang me from the compound flagpole. Later that day, she met David again. He had gotten a call from his brother, Joe, who had sat down with Ethel and Teddy for earnest talks after returning from Berkeley and promised to get his life together. Joe had been accepted at the University of Massachusetts for the fall and was having a last summer fling on Nantucket, staying in a rented house with friends. That day, he invited David to come over and spend the day and to bring Pam with him. David was ecstatic, she says. Here, finally, someone in the family was taking notice of him. They spent that Sunday at Nantucket, sailing with Joe and his friends. That night they had a cookout on the beach. The next morning they got up and went for a last swim before catching the ferry back. Joe commandeered a friend's Jeep to take them to the jetty. He was doing his Super Kennedy act, David said later. There was all this crazy energy. I suppose Teddy was that way before Chappaquiddick. As Pam KELLEY remembers the drive, we were all sort of standing up in the Jeep. Joe was cutting through the woods, spinning the Jeep in circles. We were yelling and laughing and acting crazy. There was a rest area on the other side of the highway, and Joe started to cross over to it. He didn't see the station wagon heading toward us until the last minute. Joe swerved, and we hit a ditch with our tires on the right side, breaking the Jeep's axle and flipping us. We held onto the roll bar for a couple of flips and then had to let go. Me and David were right together, in the air. I remember tumbling and seeing David's face. I hit the ground. When I tried to get up, nothing happened. David was in the same hospital with fractured vertebrae. In a traction device and unable to move, he read Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 1972 through prismatic glasses like those Teddy had used when he broke his back. He knew that Pam's injuries were more serious than his, but when one of her friends broke the news to him that Pam would never walk again, he started screaming at her. He managed to get out of bed and walked stiffly to Pam's room. "That fucking bitch friend of yours," he began yelling as he saw her. "You wouldn't believe the shit she's been telling me." Pam looked up at him, amazed that his family, whose lawyers had been talking to her and her parents about $1 million settlement, had told him nothing. "It's true," she said. Even after David had checked out of the hospital, he kept coming back to visit Pam, who was then undergoing physical therapy. He'd come in and see me, and then tell the doctors that the pain in his back and neck was intense, and that they had to readmit him. He sat beside her bed, trying to make her believe that her injuries were not as bad as the doctors had said, that she would recover from her paralysis, and that when she got out, they would be able to take up where they had left off. Sometimes he would phone her and bait her into arguments. It reached the point where I'd just have to say, "Look, I'm sorry, David. I know what your needs are, but I've just got to hang up now." A few minutes later, the phone would ring, and I'd hear this enraged voice scream, "You're an asshole!" And then he'd slam the receiver down. "You finally find someone to love," David later said about Pam, "and you lose her. It's the shits."